Hey, how you doing? I hope you're doing great today. And I want to talk with you about something that's been going on in the world of Lost Soul Aside, because a new patch just dropped, patch 1.011. And it's honestly something that's been stirring up a lot of conversations in the community. I know patches can sometimes feel like these little background things that developers push out quietly, but when a game like this is still fresh and people are in the middle of experiencing it, every update feels like a really important checkpoint in how the game is evolving. So let's just hang out for a while and go through this patch together in detail, because there's a lot to talk about. And I want to unpack everything, the fixes, the performance stuff, the little changes that might not look big at first glance, but really change how the game feels when you're playing. And because you asked for something long, we're going to take our time with it. So if you're a fan of the game or even just curious about where it's at now, this should feel like you're right here in the conversation with me. So patch 1.011 rolled out on September 30th, 2025, and it's worth remembering how the game has already had several significant updates since launch. It started with that day one patch that basically set the foundation. Then there was 1.005, 1.009, and now we've got this one. Every patch up until now has tackled a bunch of bugs and quality of life issues. And 1.009 especially was a turning point where a lot of people started saying, okay, the devs are really paying attention. But 1.111 is interesting because it feels less like a simple bug fix pass and more like a way of smoothing the entire player experience across different platforms. If you're on PS5, you'll notice it in one way, and if you're on PC, there are some things that might affect you more directly. The developers have been very intentional about making sure both versions of the game are running as smoothly as possible, and that's no small task when you've got a visually demanding action RPG like this one. Let's start with the big picture. The patch notes specifically mention fixes across multiple chapters and cutscenes, and that's something that matters more than you might think. There have been reports from players getting stuck in certain scenes, or a combat encounter wouldn't properly trigger or finish, which just kills the momentum when you're caught in a narrative or gameplay flow. Imagine you're all set up for this intense battle, you've got your skills ready, and suddenly the game just doesn't progress. That can break immersion immediately. Patch 1.011 directly targets those issues, which means fewer roadblocks to pull you out of the experience. For a game built so heavily on fast, fluid action and cinematic presentation, cutting out those interruptions is huge. Another area they've zeroed in on is UI problems in cutscenes. Now, this might sound small if you haven't experienced it, but picture being in a dramatic story moment and instead of focusing on what's happening, you've got a weird overlay or interface element stuck on screen. It's distracting and it cheapens the moment. Fixes like this don't get a ton of hype in headlines, but they're the kind of thing that makes a difference when you're actually sitting there playing through the game for hours. It feels cleaner, it feels more polished, and you stop thinking about the software and just enjoy the story and the action. Performance optimization is another key part of this patch, and I think that's where a lot of people are really feeling the difference. Lost Soul Aside is visually ambitious. It's got fast-paced combat, particle effects, flashy animations, detailed environments, and that puts pressure on hardware. On PS5, most people are running fine, but there have still been dips and stutters in certain areas. With 1.011, the devs have worked on improving stability, and while you're not suddenly going to see a miracle doubling of frame rates, what you will notice is fewer stutters and smoother gameplay overall. On PC, it's even more noticeable because hardware setups vary so much, and when the game isn't fully optimized, some people end up having a rougher time than others. This patch addresses some of those inconsistencies. If you're the kind of player who pays attention to frame pacing, micro stuttering, or just wants to make sure the game feels as responsive as possible, you're going to appreciate these behind the scenes improvements. One of the continuing threads across these patches, and it's true again with 1.011, is that the developers haven't just been reactive, they've been proactive. When I say reactive, I mean the obvious bug fixes. Players report something breaking, devs fix it, done. But proactive is when you notice things in the design that maybe aren't broken per se, but could be improved to create a better experience. And that's something they've been leaning into. For example, earlier patches brought in improvements like letting you skip cutscenes, which wasn't even a bug, it was just something people wanted. And the same thing is happening here, where some of the adjustments to autosave logic and combat progression don't necessarily fall under broken, but instead under this would feel better. That's a really important distinction because it shows that they're listening not just to bug reports, but to the way players are engaging with the game. Now, if we zoom out a little and think about how this patch fits into the overall journey of Lost Soul Aside so far, It's clear that the devs are shaping the game step by step. Remember, this is a title that was in development for years, originally a solo project, then expanded with a team, and then, after all that build-up, it finally launched in 2025. Expectations were sky high, and it's always tough for a game to live up to that kind of anticipation. The launch had its highs and lows, and a lot of the feedback centered on technical rough edges. Since then, every patch has been a chance to rebuild that trust with the player base, and 1.0 is another solid entry in that series of steps. It's like watching a sculpture take shape. At launch, you could see the vision, but it was a little rough, and now with each pass, it's being polished more and more. Um, Something else worth noting is that PC players in particular have been dealing with Epic Store login quirks and pre-order reward claim issues, and this patch continues the work of ironing out those problems. That might sound boring if you're not personally affected, but if you're someone who bought the game, pre-ordered it, and then couldn't access the bonus content you were promised, that's frustrating. Fixes like this restore confidence. They also make it clear that the developers are paying attention to not just the flashy stuff, but also the small quality of life details that impact a player's enjoyment. Let's talk about combat balance for a second. The earlier 1.005 patch was the one where they started adjusting boss fights and skill mechanics, particularly for greatswords, and people noticed it right away. 1.011 doesn't seem to bring a ton of balance changes on the surface, but the fact that stability and combat progression has been improved means you're less likely to encounter weird moments where a fight doesn't register properly or feels off. And I think this is one of those hidden wins, because when combat is the heart of your game, every little fix to how it triggers, ends, or transitions has ripple effects on the player's experience. Another point is autosave, which might sound like the simplest mechanic in the world, but when it doesn't work right, it ruins the flow of playing. Earlier patches addressed some issues with saves not triggering in certain conditions, and 1.111 continues that effort. That means fewer moments where you die or reload and realize you've lost progress because the game didn't save where it should have. If you've ever had to repeat a big fight or rewatch a cutscene just because the game didn't autosave properly, you know how annoying that is. This patch makes that less likely to happen, and that's something everyone can appreciate. Now let's also give credit to the fact that the game's presentation, its visuals and audio, have been a major talking point since launch. And while earlier patches did a lot of the heavy lifting with refinements in that area, 1.011 continues smoothing out those edges. The visual polish isn't just about graphics being pretty, it's about consistency. No one likes when textures pop in awkwardly or when lighting suddenly breaks immersion. Every tweak that reduces those moments helps the game feel more cohesive. And here's where I think it gets really interesting. These patches, including 1.011, are not just making the game better for current players, they're also building a stronger foundation for new players who are going to discover Lost Soul-Aside in the months ahead. Not everyone buys a game day one, and when people jump in later, what they experience is the patched, polished version. That means if you're watching this and you've been on the fence about picking it up, you're already in a better position now than someone who bought it at launch. And that's one of the underrated benefits of keeping up with patches like this. Um, you're seeing the game transform over time. It also speaks to how post-launch support is basically part of the modern game design process. Back in the day, you'd buy a game and that's it. You'd live with the bugs forever. Now, patches are an ongoing conversation between developers and players. Lost Soul Aside patch 1.011 is part of that dialogue.